We're going to be in Mark chapter 6 this morning. Mark chapter 6. And I just want to tell you guys, I told you earlier, man, we missed being here last week. Jessica and I were gone. We went and spent some time with my other grandmother. Went and saw her, went to church with her at North Hills Baptist Church in North Little Rock. Pastor Jim Ward, a mentor of mine, somebody I think a lot of, and he was just so excited to see us and praying for our church and wanted to hear all about all the blessings we have here at Ramsey Heights. And we needed that time to get away and be poured into and spend some time with family, but we have missed being here. I've been so excited all week about coming back and being with you, my family. It's one of those weeks where I was ready to start preaching on Thursday. We're ready to go. So I'm excited to have you guys here today and for us to be back. Want to say he's not here, but very thankful Brother Jerry was here with y'all last week. I got to see his sermon on respect and really appreciated that he was here, and you guys will be seeing him again sometime in the near future. Now, 2 weeks ago, let's pick up. We've had a little bit of a break. So 2 weeks ago and the weeks preceding that, we've been in a series called Is He Worthy? And we're tracking down this person of Jesus Christ through the Scripture, and we're trying to figure out, how do we know He is the Anointed One? How do we know He is the Messiah? Just to give you a little bit of background on what we've talked about, we talked about out of Genesis 3, the fall of man, that God had created us to be with Him and have this amazing relationship with Him. We talked about, after that there was this prophecy that God was going to bring an anointed one. The Hebrew word there is Messiah, a Messiah to come save us from our sins and our mistakes that we had messed up in, and that we were looking forward to that. And then we started looking at Jesus Christ as the answer to that promise. We talked about how John told us that in the beginning, and talked about how Jesus was not just a man who walked this earth, that He was God. He went into the eternity past. And then 2 weeks ago, we talked about two things, Sunday morning, Sunday night. We talked about the impossibility of the virgin birth, that it's impossible for a man to be born of a virgin, and that's how God puts His stamp of approval to us on Jesus, lets us know that because it is impossible, I, God, have my hand on it. And we talked about the baptism of Jesus. So since that time, we're going to fast forward a little bit. After the baptism of Jesus, He goes out and embarks on what we call His earthly ministry. He started teaching and performing miracles and healing people and doing all of these things. And we're going to fast forward through some of those miracles to a very important miracle. This is called the feeding of the multitude. It's probably one that we're all very familiar with. Now, this is very important. I was actually going to go somewhere else this Sunday, and God just really moved in my heart and put this there. So we scrapped the other plans and we went here. But as you look at this, if we're looking at proving Jesus, this might be the one miracle that we need to discuss. Out of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this is the only miracle that all four of those men recorded. It's the only one that all four of them said that is a have to have, that God influenced them to put there. So it's very, very important, and there's a lot to learn. Now let's do some background before we start reading here. Jesus has been doing miracles. He has called to Him 12 what we call disciples or apostles. He has been training them, and He has just got to a point with these disciples. He says, okay, it's your turn. He said, I've been training you. And Jesus knew what was going to happen when they were going to be in charge of church. He said, I need you 12 to go out into the cities, and you need to teach the things that I've been teaching you. And then it says the disciples had been out teaching. I think at this time they even had abilities to perform miracles. And when somebody would ask, what are you teaching and preaching about? The disciples would be, well, there's this Jesus guy. There's this Jesus guy, and He's important, and He's given us these powers, and He's taught us these things. And the disciples come back to Jesus that evening or after a couple of days, and what the Bible tells us preceding this story is that they were tired. They were wore out. The Bible tells us that they hadn't even had a chance to eat. And so Jesus looks at His disciples, at His followers, and He says, you guys need to rest. Because if you look at the Bible, rest is very, very important. God rested on the seventh day. God rested after creating the heavens and earth. And Jesus looks at the disciples and He said, y'all need to rest. Let's get in the boat. Let's get away from these cities. We're going to go across the sea here, and over there we will find rest. But there's just one little problem with that. The people were so interested in Jesus, they followed Him. And that's what we're going to pick up in Mark chapter 6, verses 31. We've got a lot of verses here. We're going to read all the way through 44 and see what happened. And He said unto them, come ye yourselves apart into the desert place, and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them and departing and knew him and ran afoot thither out of the cities and outwent him and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion towards them because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when the day was far spent, the disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered and said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, Shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread, and give them to eat? And he saith unto them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down in companies upon the green grass. And he sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed them and brake the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes he divided among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of fishes, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. Okay, so remember, you guys are participating with me today. How many of you have heard this story before? All right, good. I'm glad. That's good. So if you'll close your Bibles, we'll have invitation to go home. No, we're not going home yet. There's a lot to learn here. So here's what we're learning about the disciples. The disciples are tired. They're going across the ocean across the sea to rest. But these people have become so enamored with Jesus that they're not about to let him get away. They're coming out of the cities and they're flooding towards Jesus, and they say, there he goes. He's in that boat. And they're watching the boat and they're going, he's going to the other side. And so these people, huge mass and multitude of them, they say, well, we don't have enough boats. They walk around. Now, this is part of Jesus' plan in his earthly ministry. He is out serving and loving people and doing the impossible, and he's creating a buzz around himself so people are intrigued, and that gives him the opportunity to teach. And that's his main thing. I want to talk to these people. I want to teach them about sin. I want to teach them about grace. I want to teach them about mercy. And so as the people are following him, the plan is going completely well. This created this curiosity, because these people are hungry for something. Now let's talk about the number. How many people were there? How many? 5,000. That's what the Bible tells us. Now, as we're looking at this is a huge miracle. When we look at this, it tells us in verse 44 that Jesus fed 5,000 men. And that's a huge number of people to feed on just one little meal there. But I want to teach you something that I've learned, that I've been looking up and studying on, and something that I have never heard before, except for about the past 2 months. And I wanted to see if any of y'all knew this. Now, if you look at this, every scripture says specifically 5,000 men. 5,000 men. If you look into, it's Matthew. If you look into Matthew's account of this, and that's in chapter 14 if you want to check it. You don't have to turn there. But if you want to check me on this, Matthew goes ahead and he says something that we often forget. He says there were 5,000 men that were fed, and then he adds this to the end. Besides women and children. Besides women and children. So he says there's 5,000 men plus the women and children. They only counted the men. And you might say, well, that's a little bit weird, but we have to understand at the time period, this society, what they did is they focused on the head of the household, which was the man. And so when he put them, it says that they put them in groups of 50 and 100. The disciples would have went around counting those groups by heads of household, not by the number of people there. So this miracle is fixing to get a lot more impressive. It was impressive enough at 5,000. As you look at this, as you look at scholars and they study the time period and who they would have had, some people think that there might have been as many as a 6-to-1 ratio women and children to men. We're going to go with a little bit less than that. Let's just say on average. On average, we have these 5,000 men, and on average, they have brought their wife and 2 kids. We'll just say that's on average. Some of them would have been a man there by themselves. Some of them might have been their wife and their 10 kids. I don't know. But they had followed this. And so if you look at the estimates of the people that are here, it is much, much bigger than the 5,000. Most scholars believe that the people that were here were numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 people. Now, it just makes it a little bit more interesting. Let me give you an idea of how big that is. If you take the city of Batesville and the city of Southside and combine those two cities together, all the people living within them, that's about 15,000 people. That's the lower threshold of the number that were people following Jesus out here. It actually is probably closer to that 25,000 number. So there's just a huge amount of people there. This large crowd, and this is what Jesus sees. Jesus has been teaching and he has been loving, and he sees these people. He's going to rest, but it says he comes out. I don't know where he was. It says he turns around or whatever, and he sees this crowd, and this is what it says about Jesus. It said he had compassion upon them. He looked at this crowd and his heart went out to him. And it goes ahead and explains, why did Jesus have compassion for them? We're not to the feeding part yet. It's not because they're hungry. This is what it says. He said he looked at this crowd and he saw a crowd of sheep without a shepherd. He saw a crowd of people that were lost. He saw a crowd of people that needed guidance, a crowd of people that needed care. He saw a crowd of people that were lost. If you know anything about sheep without a sheepdog or a shepherd or somebody to take care of them, they're doomed. They will either find a way for themselves to die or something will eat them. And this is what Jesus sees. He sees this crowd of people that are unprotected, that need a leader. And so this is what he does. He sits down and he begins to teach them. He said, this is what you need. This is the leadership. Let me tell you about these spiritual things. And he does this, and this wasn't just a 25-minute sermon in a church. This goes on all day long. Jesus has to be exhausted, and he's teaching them. The disciples were already exhausted as they're going on. But Jesus knows these people are doomed if I don't lead them. Jesus later calls himself the shepherd. Now, the Bible tells us that they're in a desert place. This is not taking place in a city. It's not taking place in the delta of Arkansas, in the middle of a cornfield where there's food. They're in a desert. And as the day grows on, there starts to become a problem. How are we going to feed these people? And look at what the disciples do. The disciples come up to him. Jesus is teaching, and I guess they thought, the disciples sometimes are kind of dumb. Let's be honest. And that's okay, because it kind of expresses to us how we can be as sometimes. But the disciples come up to him, and they go, Jesus, the day has been going. You've been teaching long enough. Send them away. Make them go away. I'm sick of the noise. I'm sick of the people. Let them go find food. Now, the disciples come up with a pretty good excuse to basically tell Jesus, we're done. We're done. Have you ever heard the word hangry? It's a word that we use. I see some of you smiling. This is a word that you take the word hungry and the word angry, and you put it together, and it's what we call people when they are moody. We'll say moody because they haven't eaten in a while. I can tell you more disagreements between me and my wife have been solved by a meal, just because we get grumpy when we're hungry. The disciples were tired. They were exhausted. They were in a desert place. There was no food there, probably not even for the disciples. And the disciples are what I would call hangry, is the way I'm reading this. They're saying, Jesus, get rid of them. They're a nuisance. They're a problem. There's too many of them. There's no food out here. We don't have time for this. You need to make them go away. Now, Jesus has a completely different reaction. I want to look at the heart and the difference between Jesus. Jesus looks at the people and he sees their needs. He sees their spiritual needs. We're going to see that he sees their need for food in this story. But what did the disciples see? Disciples see problems. They see work and they see trouble. And so Jesus has this job of, not only is he teaching this crowd of 15 to 25,000, he still has his core 12 guys that he needs to discuss, and he's going to teach them a lesson as well. You know what? Jesus says, I see sheep without a shepherd, you see a nuisance. I have a lesson for you. I have a lesson for you that you can learn about these people, and you can learn about my power. So Jesus comes back to him and says, Jesus, send them away that they can go find some food. It is supper time. And Jesus comes back and he engages them in this conversation, this lesson. He doesn't tell them how horrible they are for wanting to get rid of the people. Jesus just fairly says, why don't you just feed them? Why don't we just feed them here? And the disciples did not like this answer. If you look in verse 37, I'm going to read verse 37 again. This is Jesus speaking. He answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, shall we go buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? And you can hear the disciples' disdain for what Jesus has just said. They're saying, Jesus, No, that's impossible. There's too many people here. We can't feed all these people. And they start to argue with Jesus. And this is why I say the disciples sometimes are a little bit dumb. Because Jesus says, well, why don't you feed them? And they're going, yeah, no, we can't do that. It's like they don't even know who they're talking to. They don't know they're sitting there with Jesus. Now let's talk about this number, 200 pennyworth. And what that means. 200 pennyworth is actually the Greek word used here is a denarius. And a denarius was a Roman silver coin about that big. How many of you guys saw the Kennedy silver dollars? Any of y'all? Is that right? The Kennedy silver dollars that they used to have. That's kind of what it was. It was a Roman silver coin, like a Kennedy silver dollar, and it had originally been worth the value of 10 donkeys. By this time, through inflation, it was worth the value of 16 donkeys, and that would be 1 denarius, or what our Bible here is calling 1 pennyworth. And that was the average salary per day of a person, is 1 denarius. And so this is actually Philip speaking. This is what he's saying. He's saying, Jesus, here's the problem. We've got all these people here, and you want me to go spend 200 days' salary feeding them 1 meal. He said, Jesus, we don't have that kind of money. Jesus, we can't do anything with that. Jesus, where are we going to get all that food? I can't carry that on my back. I need a wagon and horses to carry that much food. Now, I did the math on this just so we could have an understanding of this. 200 days is almost a year's salary. If you think about working 5 or 6 days a week, that's almost a year's salary. And I went and I did the math on this in today's average. And this is what he's saying. He said, Jesus, it's going to take us $36,000 to feed these people 1 meal. We don't love them that much. We don't care that much, and we don't have that much. But he forgot who he's talking to. He's talking to Jesus, who said, feed them. And so Jesus just continues on with this conversation. And he says, okay, well, that's a good point. It's almost like the disciples thought Jesus hadn't thought of it. That's a good point. He said, why don't you go find out how much food we have here? Maybe that'll be it. And so the disciples, probably hangry, probably grumpy, more than likely, they go out in the crowd and they start beating around. Who has food? Jesus needs some food. We're going to take food to Jesus. Who has food? And they come back to him, and this is what they found. It was a boy. Another gospel tells us that a boy had with him 2 fishes and 5 loaves. 25,000 people. The only person who brought lunch was a little boy. And they go and they find that, and they're coming back to him with their 2 fishes and their 5 loaves. This is all the food we could find. Now, we're going to stop the story there for a second. I want to ask you a question. What would you be thinking if you were in this crowd of 25,000, you're discussing feeding this crowd of 25,000, Jesus told you to go get food, and you're coming back with 2 fishes and 5 loaves? What's going through your mind at that moment? We're going to take 5 seconds of silence. Think about that. I think there's probably 2 answers in here. Most of you are like me, and that's not an insult. Most of you are like me. Most of us would be grumblers. It's not enough. It's not even close to enough. Oh, man. And I would probably have walked up to Jesus and been like, that's it. That's not enough. That's one person's meal. That was a dumb idea, Jesus. That's not it. Now, the truth of it is that's how most of us view Jesus and his power. Now, I just want to ask, maybe, and this came to me, and I'm going to tell you, this wasn't me, but I wonder if maybe there were some of those disciples that were coming back going, it's not enough. This was a stupid idea. But do you think maybe, possibly, the Bible doesn't tell us what the disciples are thinking, but I was reading this and it just really opened to me. I wonder if any of those disciples are going, it's not enough. Let's see what Jesus can do with it, though. Let's see what he can do. If I hand him this, it's not enough for us and we can't understand, but this is a Jesus. Maybe it's enough for him. Maybe he can figure it out. Now, I want you to think about the difference in that heart as we look at our lives, and how often do we come to God and we say, it's not enough. Maybe it's financial in our lives. God, it's not enough. Don't have enough money. Maybe it's in our church. God, it's not enough. There's not enough whatever. Maybe it's how we view our service. God, there's not enough time. And do we come to Jesus with his power and give him whatever he's blessed us with and say, Not enough. Or do we come to him and we're saying, it's not very much here, but Jesus can do something amazing. Jesus can take a little and turn it into a lot. I don't know if any of the disciples had that heart in this particular time, but I want to tell you a story. There is another time Jesus fed a multitude. I don't know if you're aware of this. There's a time in the Bible where he fed 4,000 men. Another crowd like this, and I want to tell you something very special about the disciples. This time, Jesus had to tell them, go look. They had the same conversation. Jesus, we got to feed the people. And Jesus said, feed them. And he doesn't say, go look. Guess what he says? He says, how much food do you have? And the disciples were there. It's like, this is what we got. We already went and got it. And the way I read that, the way I see that is the disciples said, we've seen this game before. We've seen Jesus take a little and turn it into a lot. And when they came and said, Jesus, we got to feed someone, they had the food ready. Do something. Do something with it. How often does our heart reflect that? Or are we like the disciples arguing with God, doubting his power, wondering what he can and can't do? Now, if you continue on down into this, into verse 41, the miracle happens. And this is a proof of God, or of Jesus' power as God. He takes these 2 fish and loaves, and I've only got fish here, and he takes them and he raises them to heaven. Now, this is different. They prayed the same way we pray. We get in a position of humility and we bow our heads. And that's how we address God. That's how Jews would have addressed God too. And so this is different. Jesus is not bowing his head, and it's not because he's being irreverent. He's lifting this up to God and he's saying, God, I thank you for this little bit. He blessed the food, not because he's worried about getting sick. He said, God, you provided. You provided for us this little bit of food. And he says, all right, guys, come here. And he drops those 2 fish in a basket and he says, go feed the people. Now, I'm wanting to know how you as a disciple would be. I was like, just 2 fish, Jesus. That's not enough. He said, go feed. Okay, I'll go feed. I'll go feed. Are you hungry? Here, we found a fish. There you go. I hope you eat. Are you hungry? That's all I've got. You're out. I only had 2 fish. I could have swore I had 2 fish. There's one. Well, good, eat. But seriously, I'm out. That's it. That's all I've got. There's more. And they just kept going around, and every time they looked in their basket, it grew. There was enough food out of that 2 fish and those 5 loaves that everybody could eat. Imagine being that disciple walking out going, I've only got 2 fish, and coming back going, wow, look at the power of Jesus Christ. He can feed the multitude. And they come back, and these disciples eat, and they're sitting with Jesus, and the story continues on. Now, I want to notice something about Jesus here. This is a proof that Jesus is God. And you say, well, obviously he created a miracle. No. There's a little bit deeper to this here. Now, if you look at Jesus, he obviously had this power to take a little and multiply it. But nowhere in the scripture do you see Jesus take money and go, more. Nowhere does he say, I'm going to be rich. Nowhere does he say, my disciples are going to be rich. The only time that Jesus takes a little and multiplies it is when he's trying to feed someone. When he's trying to feed someone and take care of their needs. Now, stay with me. I'm going to make a jump here. We're going to go back to the Old Testament. I'm going to explain something. I'm going to come back and connect it. Back to the Old Testament, there are 7 names of God. And what people did is they would take God and they would give him a name of one of his attributes because, like we say, God is love. And there was one called Yahweh Jireh. You've probably heard it as Jehovah Jireh. And this comes from a story in Genesis when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac. And he went out and he put Isaac on and he raised up the knife and God stopped him and said, stop. He said, you have to sacrifice here, but I have provided you a ram. And it says that Abraham untied his son Isaac. That must have been awkward. He untied his son Isaac, and he took the ram and he put it up on the altar and he sacrificed it to God. And this is what he said and named the place. He named the place after that attribute of God. He named that place Jehovah Jireh, and that means my God will provide. Or if we make it more personal, God my provider. And so you look at Jesus and what he's doing here is he's not just doing a miracle for the sake of a miracle. He's stepping up and he's saying, I am Jehovah Jireh. I am God the provider. I will meet your needs. That's my position and that's my heart. I have compassion on you. and I'm going to meet those needs. Jesus steps up and proves himself as one of those attributes of God. And if you were a Jew, you absolutely would have understood this is a key part of God the Father's personality. And I'm seeing it in Jesus Christ. When Jesus says, me and the Father are one, he's proved it through his actions. And so often, he will make out of our needs out of nothing. Now, this is true today, and there's a couple things I want us to take and bury in our heart today. Number one is, God is our provider. God is our provider. I'll tell you a story of a man named Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor, I've talked to a few of you about this. Hudson Taylor was a missionary in the 1850s. He went to China in the 1850s. That's when it took weeks to get across the ocean, and he went with $0. He went with nothing. And this is what he said. He said, my God's going to provide for me because I'm doing God's work. And every time he would get a little money and he'd give the last little bit out that evening, more money would come in. When his house disappeared, when he lost his house or something bad happened, another house popped up. When he said, I've got this problem, I got people coming to see with me, I need a place, it would just appear. And it got to the place where he had these missionaries working underneath him, and they would routinely give away everything, give away the house, give away the money. And as soon as their hands were completely empty, somebody'd come up to him and say, Hudson, we're out. And he'd go, good. That means it's time for God to come through and provide for us. And he would every time. Thousands of people saved in China because this man went out and he had in his heart, God is my provider, Jehovah Jireh. He'll take little, he'll take nothing, and he'll make it into something. Thousands of people were saved through that attitude here. Now, we need to continue on. We're almost done here. We need to continue on and look at a couple more little details. I want to read verse 43. Listen to this. So, everybody's ate. The Bible tells us that it wasn't just like they had a bite to eat. Everybody was full. They've stuffed themselves. And Jesus says, okay, here's what I need you guys to do. I need you guys to go pick up whatever's left. Whatever's left, go get it. And so the disciples get their baskets. They're not hangry anymore. I suppose they've probably got it figured out at this point. And as they're going on, they get their baskets, and this is what it says in verse 43. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes. 12. Now, to me, you tell me this story. Jesus feeds all of these people. Jesus takes care of their needs. Jesus steps into the place of Jehovah Jireh. It's enough to just say, and there was some left over. That's a good enough detail. But every time this story is told, there's a focus on that number 12. It was very important to God that this made it in the Bible 4 times. Not just they went and got baskets full. Not just that they had more left over. It said there were specifically, count them, 12 baskets. There's a message in this that Jesus is speaking to his disciples. Certain numbers in the Bible have a very special meaning. You guys are probably familiar with the number 7, the number of perfection. That is God's number of perfection. He created the heaven and the earth in 7 days, rested on the 7th day. We know that's the number of perfection. But 12 is also a very important number in the Bible and very important to God. I don't know why, but it is. There were 12 tribes of Israel. There were 12 apostles. When the chief priest went into the Holy of Holies, he wore on his vest 12 stones. When you see in Revelation the New Jerusalem, the walls are 144 something high. I forgot what the measurement was, which is a multiple of 12 times 12. 12 is very important, and listen to me. The number 12 in the Bible, anytime you see the number 12, it means this. It means complete and finished. Complete and finished. Now, to us, that's something we have to learn. The disciples come back and they're looking at numbers and going, oh, wow, there's 12. That sends an immediate message to them. And this is what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I will completely meet the needs of my people. I won't just give them enough to get them through. I will completely meet their needs. They will be taken care of completely. Jesus said something else a little bit similar to that when he was on the cross. Remember, 12 means complete or finished. And when he was on the cross, the last thing he said was this: it is finished. It is complete. I have completely done what I need to for them. Jesus is teaching his disciples. Now, this lesson is very well learned by them. One last little bit, excuse me. One last little bit, if you'll turn over to Luke 9, or you can just listen. We just have a verse here. Luke 9 is also the story of the feeding of the multitude. And this is what it says in verse 18. We're going to read through verse 20 here. So immediately after this, verse 17 tells us that they had got the 12 baskets. Verse 18. And it came to pass, as he was alone praying, his disciples were with him. And he asked them, saying, Whom say the people that I am? They answered and said, John the Baptist. But some say Elias. And others say that one of the old prophets is risen again. And he said unto them, But who say ye that I am? Peter answering said, The Christ of God. Now, Jesus, right after this, the Bible records right after this, after he did this miracle, after he says, I'm Jehovah Jireh, I'm God the provider, I'm completely providing for everybody, I have this miracle to feed them. Sometime after, it might have been right there that day, it might have been the next night, I don't know when it was, but the Bible records it as the next thing that happens. And Jesus has this conversation and said, I've got a question. You've been among the masses in the cities, you've been teaching, and you were there at the feeding of the 25,000. Who do all these people think that I am? And the disciples started to mutter out, well, some people think that you're John the Baptist who was baptizing people in the wilderness, but he got beheaded. He's dead now. They think that you're him come back. Some people think that you're Elijah, the prophet of the Old Testament that called down fire from heaven, and when it was time for him to go to heaven, he didn't die. God came and got him, or angels came and got him in a chariot of fire. They think Elijah's finally back. They've been waiting for hundreds of years for Elijah to come back. And then they listed off these other Old Testament prophets. Maybe you're Ezekiel, maybe you're Isaiah. And Jesus doesn't correct them, but he asked those 12 disciples, and you who've been with me, you have seen what I've done. You who have watched me feed the multitudes, who do you think I am? And Peter, who is always the first to answer and usually has the wrong answer, Peter does this. Peter stands up and he says, I've seen enough. You are the Christ. That's the Greek word anointed one. He said, you are the Messiah. I believe you are the one God sent. I believe you are God himself. Now, as we go through this morning, I just want to know that everybody in this room has that in their heart and in their mind, that I believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. I believe that he is the one who came and died for my sins and all the things that I did wrong. I want to make sure that's in your heart. The second thing I want to make sure that's in our heart as we leave here is, number one, whatever we're facing in life, do we truly believe that God and Jesus is our provider? That he can take a little and make a lot out of it. That regardless of what we can see, God has the power to do something very, very special. This is a time of invitation and a time of meditation. If you'd like to pray, this is open to you, and I would love to speak with you. Would you please stand? Brother Danny.